Hello, my name is Aaron Kraft. I've not had the opportunity to meet all of you yet, but I hope to be able to do so in the years to come. I joined Progress Software just about 10 months ago with the incredible opportunity of being able to lead a group of amazing, talented engineers in Progress Chef's business unit. Today, I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about something that I'm really passionate about, DevSecOps, and what does it look like into the next generation of DevSecOps. We've come a long way, but we need to go a long way still in order to be able to accomplish some of the original goals and objectives for those that came together to start these ideas. Let me start off by telling you a little story about why something like this is important to me. 5 or 6 years ago, I found myself sitting in this room, large conference room. I think it was on the 7th floor. It was in a downtown office building. It was filled with the unpleasant smell of Kung Pao chicken and breakfast burritos that had piled up over several days. Worse than the stink was the glare of the occasional executive that popped their head into the room and uttered those infamous words, "Are we up yet?" If all that wasn't painful enough, the ever-present reality of the fact that we were calculating losses at approximately $2 million an hour because it was during peak season for this company, and this was now day 3. As I was sitting there, feeling more than a little bit uncomfortable, trying not to make eye contact with the CEO when he walked in, I think I closed my eyes for a second and maybe even clicked my heels together, wondering, could that make it all go away? In that moment, that's when the words of a former colleague of mine came to mind. She used to tell us all the time that hope is not a strategy. And she was right and continues to be right. Hoping that something is going to get better doesn't make it better in and of itself. I think we can all agree that the world has gotten pretty complex, if it was ever simple in the first place. Complexity in technology is leading the way. It is growing by orders of magnitude every year. The exponential growth of devices that run our lives is just one good example of that. If you go back to 1975, when Gordon Moore, often quoted, came up with the idea that became known as Moore's Law, that the number of transistors that we could fit on a chip was going to double every year, it seemed crazy. You see, back in 1970, it was extraordinarily if you could smash more than 1,000 transistors onto a chip. Today, we get more than 50 billion transistors onto a single chip. Imagine where things are going to go as we approach nanotechnology and biological computers. Beyond that, think about, just Internet of Things devices as one measurement of the growth, expansion, and complexity. Last year, that topped by one measurement over 12.3 billion devices. That was up from 4.6 billion measured in the same study just 5 years earlier. All those little bits of technology that control so many elements of our lives, from the smart thermostat to the refrigerator to the doorbell, even my gas grill that tells me when the hamburgers are done. That's just the stuff that's on the home front, the personal devices. Think about everything that is managing the hospitals and managing the warehouses and the manufacturing facilities. Can you imagine the size of an IoT device if we needed a Crane computer with the transistors of the day to power each one of those things? The number of growth there is a 300% increase. 300%. And that doesn't include all of the cell phones and tablets and laptops and desktops and servers that power what is clearly the information age. I think it's a very amazing time to be alive. Well, it is, except when you're the person that's charged to keep all those things up and running. And so sometimes it's not. We need to be thinking about DevSecOps, the next generation. Where does it go from here? What have we accomplished, but what else do we need to do? I would make the argument that we need to think about how we can make all of these things easier to use, approaching things from a human-centric perspective, so that we have systems that can handle all of the complexities under the hood to make sure that we have security and consistency and efficiency. The need for all of this isn't new, but the urgency is greater because we do risk that at some point, some of this is going to collapse under the groaning weight of the scale that is in front of us. The problem is not primarily a people problem, although we have some of those we have to continue to work on, but there are a lot of things that we need to fix in the technology. You see, I think that in many ways we are still trying to be the computer. We just want to be more efficient or faster at doing the work of the computer. Instead, we need to own the responsibility of the operator, of the administrator, of the person that is overseeing everything that we do that contributes to the business needs, the organizational wants and desires, not the care and feeding of the machine. Now, I would imagine that since most of you are participating in ChefConf, that you are quite familiar with the idea of DevOps or DevSecOps, as it's been called by many recently. I think security was always a part of DevOps. It's just highlighted here because of the criticality that is inherent in a largely interconnected world. For anyone who may not be familiar with DevOps or DevSecOps, though, let me just say that it is commonly understood to be a set of practices that help to speed up the process of getting software securely into the hands of its users, and for many of us here, keep it running. The annual DevOps Research and Assessment Report, or the DORA report, will break this down into 3 big categories. They'll talk about software delivery. They'll talk about the IT operations, which really includes both the infrastructure piece and the security piece. And then they'll talk about the organizational performance. These are very important areas that we need to think about individually and as you bring those different pieces together. Now, that's kind of a simple overview of DevOps, but if I were to repurpose an old joke, I could say if you got 15 IT professionals into a room and asked them what DevOps was, you'd likely get at least 25 different answers. So if we're going to talk today a little bit about DevOps and where it's going, we should think a little bit about where it's come from. You can see in this image the idea that DevOps oftentimes means different things to different people based on where they're putting their hand on the elephant. There's a tech part to the overall DevSecOps strategy. You'll hear people talk rightly about the need for people, process, and technology changes in order to accomplish it. Chef, we work a lot on the technical pieces because we provide some of the tools that you all use to be able to accomplish your DevOps, DevSecOps journey. One of the original ideas around DevOps or DevSecOps was that we would be able to bring together organizationally teams that had all of the skills so they could be self-sufficient. That would go along with the agile self-organizing teams. The problem is that doesn't necessarily work in every organization. Not everybody is able to create that whole cloth team to have all the skills they need to be able to own something end to end. Does that mean that DevOps doesn't work? No, it just means that it has to be adapted to consider the organizational needs that you have, whether those are different because of the technology or the structure, the culture, or even the regulations that you're facing. With a lot of these things coming together, and yet some of these things not working out according to the original ideas and concepts, we need to rethink of what this might look like. When you have a distributed model and you have shared services teams, how can you still practice DevOps? I believe that you really can. Going back a little bit again, though, in history, let's look at how recent so much of this actually is. It was only back in 2009 when a group of engineers got together in Belgium for the very first DevOps Days conference, talking about speed and quality and security. That's only 13 years into the journey. At the same time, at the exact same time, Chef had its initial release in 2009. In 2013, just fast forwarding a few years, that's when Gene Kim came out with the Phoenix Project. It popularized the DevOps ideas by telling a story about a guy named Bill, who was an IT manager for a company called Parts Unlimited, and he faced massively over budget, late, and yes, mission critical projects. I'm sure that has never been any of your all's problems. That's only 9 years into the journey. In 2016, Dr. Nicole Forsgren, who was at the time Chef's Director of Organizational Performance and Analytics, began to prepare to release the work that she and Jez Humble and Gene Kim were working on that would be known as the first DORA report that allows us to track the adoption of DevOps practices around the globe. That's only 8 years ago. None of that is very long ago, but technology years is kind of like dog years, so it feels like a different century to us. I've been a practitioner of DevOps from early days, and I can tell you one thing, at least for me, a lot of it feels harder today than it did 10 years ago. And that's not because there was anything wrong with the original concept, but because technology continues to explode, like we would have a Mentos that has been dropped into a Coke bottle. So when I think about the question, what does DevSecOps where does DevSecOps go from here, I am drawn particularly to the idea that we need greater simplicity. We need to make sure that we have the ability to simplify, as Thoreau put it. It's one thing to just automate things, but if we just move things like command line executed scripts to code checked into repositories executed by pipelines, in some cases, we may have just shifted the problem to another part of the chain. It can be just as easy to check in bad automation code as it is to flub something on the command line. Sure, now we know who merged the code in, and hopefully we can reverse it much more quickly, but we still get crushed under the sprawl of the automation code that's supposed to be making all of our lives easier. There are encouraging things about what's happening, though. Last year, the DORA report received responses from more than 32,000 IT professionals worldwide. Here's some of the things that they point out that are going well for those that are participating in the survey. The elite performers, as classified by DORA, now account for about 26% of the participants. That's up from 20% just 2 years earlier. Elite performers were twice as likely to have security integrated into the software development process. I think we can all agree that that is a very good thing. And elite performers continue to skyrocket, as you can see from the numbers here, in their number of deployments and the reduction in lead time, the amount of change failure rates, and the amount of time that it takes to restore and resolve problems. So all of that is excellent. But I think there's something else that we need to take into consideration. While as exciting as that data is, keep in mind that according to Statista, that by 2023, we are anticipated to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 62 million information and communication technology professionals in the world. So that's a lot of IT professionals that we're not getting information back, and may represent a lot of organizations that haven't yet participated in this DevSecOps journey. So we need to have a better understanding of what's going on out there, what kind of hybrid approaches are being adopted, if they're being adopted at all. Some of this does come back to the tooling. If you have ever seen a chart of DevSecOps tools, then you can appreciate that there's no such thing as a DevOps tool. It is a tool chain. This periodic table of DevOps tools helps to illustrate that. They operate in different spaces, different niches, and they require a certain amount of subject matter expertise for different people to run different tools. Knowing how to operate all of these things is getting almost as complicated as finding that unicorn person who can code well in a dozen languages, secure your systems and your networks, provision your VMs, harden your images, manage your clusters, and keep the sprawling spaghetti mess of pipelines up and running. It's just a lot of work for any one individual to do. Chef's roots are rooted in that area of infrastructure as code, which is, of course, a part of DevSecOps. We are particularly known for configuration management, but over the years, it didn't take that long for us to come along with areas of application packaging, application delivery, and continuous compliance. Whether it has to do with software or hardware, Chef's particular slice or particular area of this tool chain is around the operations. It's around automating IT operations, the application side and the system side. Progress can also offer dev tools like Fiddler and Kendo that allow us to help expand the total amount of tool chain that we can provide for you in your DevOps journey. But when you think of Chef, think of the automation that is needed to operate these complex systems, both the software and the hardware. When it all began, Chef was trying to make the lives of system administrators a little bit easier, and that is a noble goal. But now the requirements for what we provide go all the way up to the C-suite, who are accountable not just to the internal IT group, but primarily to the customer, to the shareholder, which is why that financial services organization that I was talking about at the beginning was not primarily a need for just making sure that the technology people had done what they needed to do, but they had to make sure that they could get everybody out of that smelly conference room and get back down to the business that they were in. So how are we going to go about the process of simplifying things in the technology universe? I think there are three different things we should consider as we look at the next generation of DevSecOps. One is to provide a more holistic approach to operations. We need to be able to look out over that field to be able to see the field from the corn, the forest from the trees. It shouldn't be the human operator's responsibility to have to go find the one bad stalk out there. Let's leave that to the computers. DevSecOps is an idea. It has goals, it has objectives. Automation is oftentimes the mechanism behind it to make it work. Automation is not new, but things have got so complex today that we need to simplify how automation works. At this point, I can think of one use case in my life where there is automation that is automating automation that is automating automation, which seems absolutely crazy. And it's no wonder that we're going to have things get lost in the mix. Take the cloud as one particular use case. The promise was that the cloud was going to make things so much easier. And in many ways, it has. But depending upon who you talk to in early days, it sounded like it was going to automatically handle all the operations for us. And I think most of you who are involved in operations understand that it does not do that. Today, we are writing automation that sits on top of cloud services because managing the cloud has just become too difficult at scale. At Chef, we've been told that configuration management is only relevant in the data center. But you know what? When you look out over the vast landscape of IT management, it all requires configuration. Whether you're setting up Lambda functions or a Kubernetes cluster, someone configured those things. How many unicorns is it going to take to be able to handle all the different services and technologies that we need to operate our businesses? What about all the configuration that is needed to make sure that we have compliant systems, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud, let alone making sure that they stay compliant? And it's not like there is this simple one-size-fits-all model. When you look at the 21 DORA report, the respondents there have 24% were in the data center only. 34% were hybrid, meaning that there was some aspect of on-prem and some aspect of the cloud. 29% were operating the private cloud, which reminds me of the old expression, there's no such thing as the cloud, it's just somebody else's data center. Meaning that somebody has to manage and operate all that hardware in order to make that private cloud or the public clouds function. All this adds to the variability and the complexity of our operations game. It is important to have tools that can span each of these different approaches, but can't be driven primarily by an ideology. We have to make sure that we don't try to force fit things into a DevSecOps ideology, but meet the organization's individual needs based on their context and their industry. The second thing I think we need to do as we consider the next generation of DevSecOps is to think much more about a human-centric approach to solving problems, as opposed to a technology-centric approach where we're just automating something that technology does, as opposed to looking at the big picture. We continue to see a positive mindset expand about technology and how it interacts with our lives, with some skepticism, understandably. But we need to make sure that we're not focusing too hard on the computers are coming to take my job aspect. We need to think computers are coming to make my job better so that I can have a better experience and I can provide more value to my organization. That means that we need to develop more human-centric systems to make our lives easier by dealing with the radical expansion of technology, which is showing no signs of decline and likely never will. People are amazing, they're creative, they're innovative, they created the computers, they benefit from the technology. They should always be at the center of things. One thing that we've noticed at Chef is that there's a tendency to want to go out and create more and more tools to fill that already crowded chart, when in reality, there are plenty of tools to solve all the problems if we just focus more on the solution than the tool itself. Now, there's no doubt that tools need to improve, and there are probably some that are lacking, but let's take a step back and think about what does it take to solve the problem. Many of you are familiar, I think, with tools that Chef offers like Infra and Habitat and Inspect, some great tools for which we owe much to the open source community that poured their hearts and souls into their creation, from collaboration to commitment. And we look forward to continuing that collaboration with all of you. But instead of thinking about Infra and Habitat and Inspect as tools in a toolbox, let's start thinking about how do we get to zero trust environments? How do we ensure continuous compliance end to end, pre-configuration, post-configuration? What happens if there's drift? How do we remediate? This happens throughout the entire life cycle and uses all these different tools under the hood. We also need to make sure that we can manage that snowball of IoT and edge devices. The questions that we need to be asking should be human-centric. What is best for your business? What is best for your customer, for your user? What's going to drive revenue up and risk down? How do we free you to focus on the creative and innovative? What can we do to help prevent burnout from overwork and stress? You are the most valuable resource that your organization has. How can our systems enhance and empower you to do all the more? That's the kind of people-oriented thinking that needs to drive the direction of the next generation of DevSecOps, elevating above a micro-level process automation and an individual technology action to a big picture answer. Not how can I do this, even if it's how can I do this more efficiently, but why am I doing this in the first place? What am I getting out of it? Finally, let's talk about that third element, providing the easy to use tools that enable the solutions that are needed for organizations to be able to get where they need to go. Making things easier is not a new discussion, but in the world of DevSecOps, it needs to be a top priority. So many of us are geeks and we wear that term proudly. We don't think twice about hitting an API endpoint, and the command line is where we live. That's awesome, and we celebrate that at Chef, but not everyone who needs to be involved in our DevSecOps processes are equally comfortable or are masters of all of the domains that are needed to make it happen. If you were to search engine of your choice the term ClickOps, you would see that there's a fair amount of debate out there about its use. ClickOps is basically the idea of providing a UI front end for your ops tools. James Otter argued in a blog post back in 2020 that ClickOps needs to be, quote, banished for all eternity, end quote. Needless to say, I think that Mr. Otter was very passionate about this. At the core of his argument is the idea that it's going to slow everything down because it's going to make us have to go back to a web page so that we can click on something to order up something. And what we really want is everything operating fluidly end to end all the time. I understand the concern, and I really don't want that either, but I don't think one thing has to be related to the other. So what if my ClickOps enabled tools are generating the YAML or the cookbooks or the policy as code and putting those things into the repo for me? What if it prevents me from having to be an expert about this part of it or that part of it? So even that I don't have to go out in my favorite text editor and manually do those things. The UI can make it easier for people who are not skilled across all of the disciplines to get a solution that they need that complies with the regulations of the organization. It also doesn't have to be something that is initiated each and every time by a human being. What if you create those little tidbits, those little code segments, and then you could subscribe to events so that you don't have to build and maintain those things anymore. The complexity is called and invoked by an event-driven system. Why wouldn't we want to use those kinds of technologies to simplify and speed up the process for those that could take advantage of them? At Chef, we are going to be API first, we are going to be command line next, then we would be UI after that. But we do want to provide an opportunity for people to take advantage of all of the intelligence that can go into a tool to distill the subject matter expertise that is so hard to find in those unicorns. Automation isn't just about building something that is always running. It's also about building a repeatable process that can be run as needed. Whether that thing is kicked off by an event, or maybe it's on a timer, or if there's a human being who makes the decision to do so. At Progress Chef, we want to help enable the kind of holistic, human-centric, and easy-to-use approaches to manage all of that complexity that's around us. Whether your journey is called the DevOps journey, the DevSecOps journey, the automated ops, the purple ops, or the I want to spend more time fishing ops journey. Things are changing. They are changing quickly. Technology is changing the way that DevSecOps is practiced, and DevSecOps is changing the way that technology is built. So let's look out over the horizon and think a little bit about some of the things that are going to shape the future of DevSecOps as the technology moves, whether DevSecOps is ready for it or not. There are going to be continued developments in the areas of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We already see this happening today, but imagine what's going to happen the more deep learning we get that is allowing those AI ops engines to be able to determine things in advance, the predictive analysis, to be able to solve problems before they've ever occurred, before they've ever caused an issue. That's going to leave valuable time for IT professionals to focus on the problems and the solutions, the ones that can't be dealt with yet by AI. As we touched on earlier, there is quite an expansion of different mixtures of multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, and a lot of those different things are used to empower the IoT and the edge devices. It's really important that we are able to manage all of the different evolutions and configurations and variations that are needed around the globe to manage these complex systems. Our customers and our users want their technology to work consistently and securely, whether that's part of an ordering system that's delivering up broccoli cheddar soup, it's monitoring the use of forklifts in a warehouse, or if it allows a nurse to take a patient's vitals, better yet, automatically logging them so that the nurse can focus on the caregiving that inspired them to become a nurse in the first place. Your customers and your users do not care and should not have to care about the complexity of making it all work. Frankly, it would be really good if we could all care, or at least worry a little less about whether or not it's continuing to function. A little bit further out, we see new and interesting technologies on the horizon, things like low code and AI code. Some of those have already begun to make their way into your workplaces, but what are the operational implications of that? When you don't have a development team building automated testing into all of those different things, how do you ensure that the quality is going to stay there? How do you make sure that everything is operating at scale and that the load is going to work? All of the different concerns that we have. AI coding in and of itself is really, really interesting. And when we think about the idea of deep learning, imagine all of the coding practices that could be developed and learned from just taking all of the publicly available GitHub code and using that to help train engines to be able to spit out compile-ready code. But when they can, are you ready for that compile-ready code to be auto-compiled and then auto-deployed? Have you thought about all of the different aspects operationally of making sure that that code stays in compliance, whether that's on the infrastructure side where it's deployed or on the application side? I think that some of you may have just shuddered a little bit at the thought of all of that. While these kinds of things may make the development part of the cycle easier, operations is going to have to undergo similar disruptions to maintain parity with the development side. In fact, that is a whole conversation in and of itself, but I think that when you look at DevOps or DevSecOps, it has historically been tilted a little bit more in the direction of the development side of things and a little less in the operations and the reliability side of things. That's why the DORA report says that people are now seeing things like SRE and DevOps as more consistent with each other. They're beginning to blend together. But as we think about next generation DevSecOps, we definitely need to be thinking about all of the things that have to be enhanced and improved upon on automated operations. Kubernetes, for instance, is a fantastic platform, but the complexity in maintaining it continues to challenge many operations teams, unless they happen to be staffed with some of those people who are pretty deep and wide in some very specific skills. So cluster management, it's likely going to have to go a little bit more under the hood, like the engine under my car. I understand that there are certain components in there, like a carburetor, and they tell me there's a fuel pump and stuff. But at the end of the day, I put my foot on the brake and I press the start button because I'm not a mechanic. And so I don't need to understand how all of that works. There's already evolutions happening with certain cloud providers and VMware to help drive some of that under the hood, but that's probably going to be something that has to continue to develop. So how can we help at Progress? How can we contribute from what we've already built and what we're planning to do in the future? We know that there is a lot that we have to do to continue evolving with the trajectory of next generation DevSecOps, but there is already a lot that we can provide to help you accomplish your goals. For instance, We have continuous compliance solutions that help you scan small and large systems, that help you adhere to your ever-expanding set of compliance rules so that your audit or your GRC or InfoSec and cybersecurity are all happy. And man, it is a good day when you can make all of those groups happy, right? Our infrastructure management solutions allow you to configure hundreds, thousands, or even millions of devices that need to be set up in the same way, or possibly in different ways that are driven by all kinds of crazy variables like the location around the globe. This is not your grandfather's infrastructure management. We need to be able to handle servers and desktops and IoT and edge devices, single board computing, and the like. We have application delivery software that allows you to keep your application up to date and running where you need it, when you need it, and as fast as you need it. For instance, what we provide here complements Kubernetes by addressing use cases where it's difficult for Kubernetes to go, such as maintaining those edge devices. We do so by breaking it down into layers so that it's easier in a low bandwidth environment with all the complexities that come along with the often uncontrolled edge. These are the tools that many are already familiar with Progress Chef, but by being a part of Progress Software, it's important to know that that brings along with it network configuration tools, monitoring tools, application load balancing, that even manages Kubernetes ingress so that you can use the same operational tool for both cloud-based and on-prem management. Progress Chef is just the third leg of a three-legged stool within Progress Software, and that's great because it allows us to bring together larger segments of that tool chain for your automated operations. Progress has a great start in the field of technology automation. I hope it positions us well to continue to have an influence in where DevSecOps goes from here. It's been a passion of mine for a number of years. So as we look out over the short and long-term horizons, we see all kinds of possibilities to simplify your operations, reduce your risk, increase the value that you provide to your customers. We've been around since early days of DevSecOps. We have been on this journey from the start with you, our users, the businesses that you empower, and we're ready to go on to the next leg of this journey together. Let me go back briefly for that miserable conference room moment with all that smelly, stale food and even more stress. And say this, after more than 3 days, potential losses that were calculated at possibly $150 million, we finally figured out what happened. Someone who shouldn't have logged into a critical part of the network hardware, manually made a change. There was no record of it. There was no backup of the previously working configuration. There was no way to automatically revert back when the alerts started piling up. Imagine what that company would have given if they had the opportunity to prevent that from happening in the first place. You know what? The tools were already there. They weren't being used, probably because the tools that the networking people and the tools that the security people and the tools that the server admins used were different and therefore foreign to each of the different teams. What a perfect use case for a unified DevSecOps approach. Whether that means one team with lots of skills or 3 different teams, we need to make sure that everybody is using the same language and using the same tool set whenever possible. Everybody in that organization cannot be a unicorn, but the tools that we can create can make people just as valuable as a unicorn. I'm very excited to see where the next generation of DevSecOps is going and how we at Progress Chef have an opportunity to be a part of that journey. I'd love to ask, please connect with me on LinkedIn, reach out on community.chef.io, send me an email at aaron.craft, aaron.kraft@progress.com. I would love to continue the conversation well beyond this conference, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your ChefConf.